Have you ever been judged unfairly just because of who you are? Imagine the shock of a lifetime when an innocent man's life is turned upside down by his neighbor. In today's story, a racist neighbor's decision to call the police on a hardworking farmer leads to a twist that no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is one you don't want to miss. It was an ordinary day on the farm. Jim, a humble farmer, had been tending to his land for years. His mornings started early, and his evenings ended when the sun dipped below the horizon. He loved his life. Simple, steady, but full of hard work. There was a rhythm to his days that brought peace. But there was one thing he couldn't avoid: the neighbor. Her name was Linda, and she lived 2 houses down from Jim. To anyone else, Linda seemed like just another person in the neighborhood, but Jim had always sensed something off about her. She rarely smiled, never waved back when he greeted her, and most notably, she kept to herself. But it wasn't just that. Jim, a farmer by trade, had always been a person who respected everyone, regardless of their background. But Linda? She didn't like his presence. From the start, she had made it clear in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways that she didn't want someone like Jim living near her. Every time Jim's tractor passed by her house, she'd make a comment to herself or shake her head. But Jim kept going about his business, not thinking much of it. What could he do? He was just trying to work. One afternoon, while Jim was on his farm doing some routine maintenance, he noticed Linda standing near the edge of her yard, staring directly at him. Her eyes weren't just filled with disdain. There was something more, a determination. Something wasn't right. Imagine being in Jim's shoes. What would you do if someone was watching your every move? Not just observing, but judging you? The next day, it happened. Jim was unloading hay from his truck when a squad car pulled into the driveway. The police officer stepped out, looked around, and then approached Jim with a stern expression. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jim asked, trying to hide the confusion in his voice. The officer glanced over his shoulder at Linda, who was now standing at the end of her driveway, her arms crossed. "We've received a call. Someone claims you're causing a disturbance." Jim's heart sank. "A disturbance? What are you talking about?" The officer didn't respond immediately, but nodded towards Linda. She pointed her finger at Jim and said, "He's always making noise. His tractor's too loud. It's ruining the peace of the neighborhood. I want him gone." Jim was stunned. Linda had called the police over something so trivial: his tractor. This wasn't just a complaint. This was an attempt to get him removed from the area. Jim was now in a tight spot. He tried to explain to the officer that he was merely doing his job, that he had every right to operate his equipment on his own property. But the officer wasn't listening. The tension between them was rising, and the situation seemed to be escalating. That's when the officer turned to Jim and said something that changed everything. "If you don't calm down, I'll have to take further action. You might be disturbing the peace." Imagine the frustration Jim felt. He was simply doing his job, and now he was being accused of something he hadn't even thought of. What could he do? He couldn't make his tractor quieter. It was part of his livelihood. What would you do in Jim's situation? Would you fight back, or would you just accept the unfairness? But Jim wasn't the kind to back down. He knew something wasn't right here. He decided to take a stand. Jim invited the officer to walk with him to the back of his property, where he had a perfect view of the fields and the barn. He explained that his tractor wasn't just for show. It was essential for keeping his farm running smoothly. "I understand it's loud," Jim said, "but I've lived here for years, and I've never had a complaint. Why now?" The officer seemed unsure, but Linda wasn't backing down. She raised her voice from the end of the driveway. "You shouldn't even be here. People like you don't belong in this neighborhood." It was then that Jim realized this wasn't just about noise. It was personal. Linda wasn't upset about his tractor. She was upset about him, about his lifestyle, about who he was. Just as the situation seemed like it was about to boil over, something unexpected happened. The officer, who had been listening intently to Jim's side of the story, turned around and walked toward Linda. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice calm but firm, "I need to speak with you for a moment." Jim watched in disbelief as Linda began to argue with the officer. What was going on? The officer paused and then said something that left Linda speechless. "You're the one who made the complaint, right?" he asked. "Yes, I did," Linda snapped. "Well, I've been informed that you've been making unfounded accusations about Jim for some time now, and this is the last straw. We've received multiple complaints about you disturbing the peace in this neighborhood. Multiple. From your neighbors." Linda's face turned red as the officer continued. "In fact, we've had reports of you engaging in racial harassment on several occasions. You've targeted other people here, including Jim." Jim's mouth dropped open. He hadn't known this was going on. And yet, here was the officer, exposing Linda for the very thing she had tried to accuse him of. With a look of sheer shock, Linda turned and walked back toward her house, her face pale. She had just received the surprise of her life. So, what did Jim do after that? He didn't gloat. He didn't yell. He simply got back to work. But from that day on, things were different. People knew the truth, and Jim's reputation only grew stronger. Imagine facing an accusation so wild, only to find out the real story behind it. How would you react if you were Jim? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more twists and shocking tales. And leave a comment. What would you have done in Jim's situation?